Somewhat recently, I played Coromon, a monster tamer RPG that has all the easy hallmarks of the subgenre. It's got the type charts, the evolutions, the collection of 100-some creatures to mix and match a team of 6 with. It's far from a bad game. It has about the same level of mechanical depth you'd expect from a Pokemon-like, even coming with features like a built-in Nuzlocke and randomizer modes. Heck, I'd go so far as to say it has even more visual polish than Pokemon's games these days. Despite this, though, I found the game hard to stay invested in, even compared to Pokemon's more hit-or-miss output as of late, especially with how these features feel present by obligation. That said, I think a large part of why I'd struggled to really sink my teeth in any of these recent monster tamers because of their rather bland monster design, a lot of which, while grasping what Pokemon's putting down, really lack that creative bite their inspiration has. Personally speaking, I tend to like strange, creative, and unconventionally cool designs. Stuff along the lines of Electros, Sigilif, Vanillux, Barbaracle, etc. That is to say, no, stuff along the lines of Orange Dinosaur and Moonwolf just don't do anything for me. I find that creature catchers are only as good as their creature designs, and most of Pokemon's recent imitators have ones that are passable and very safe. Perhaps the fear being they see how Pokemon fans react to Pokemon like Garbodor or Bruxish, and just opt out of having anything all that challenging. Fair enough, but I feel like this hurts these games more than anything, since I've always felt like one of Pokemon's strongest feats is its sheer amount of design variety, even back in its early days where it felt like there was a Pokemon for everybody, no matter what your tastes were. I know you can't reasonably judge an indie passion project with the biggest multimedia franchise on the planet with the same brush, but I'd also be lying if I didn't say I wasn't that impressed. While Pokemon titles become mixed bags in terms of overall quality, one thing they've almost never rested on their laurels about was bringing in new and inventive designs. It's hard to come up with a team of 6, but mostly because I feel really spoiled for choice, as opposed to Coromon, where a team of 6 feels hard to achieve because I'm struggling to find even one I love. This is part of why Cassette Beasts makes such a strong first impression. Where all of its contemporaries were trying to do Pokemon but with a small spin on things, this game doesn't even bother to ease you into the setting by having its own Rattata or Pidgey. Instead, the type of beast littering the first area being creatures like a hermit crab made of road construction gear, a masquerade snake, and a Batman wannabe hobgoblin. The first half hour of Cassette Beasts has done more to keep me hooked than any other Pokéclone, with it really showing its cards to you as soon as possible. It quickly reveals how catching, or in this game recording, certain monsters will grant you new special movement abilities that allow for overworld travel. A fun new twist on HMs. It's not too long after this that they throw another curveball in the form of the Archangels, these extra-large creatures that exist specifically to be a big boss fight. The battle against Morgant at the beginning of the game is when I knew this wasn't going to be as by the books as the others. I was ready to see more, both in terms of what creatures I could be catching, but now I was interested in what these Archangel things were about. It's also here that they show off the fusion mechanic, where you and your teammate will merge into one extra powerful creature that deals more damage and can take more punishment. I do find the implementation of fusion itself a little dodgy though. With this game currently having 128 base creatures in it, that means there's tens of thousands of possible combinations of 2 in there. I can't reasonably say I expect them to hand design every single one, since that would require an obscene amount of work, both in terms of coming up with clever fusions and having to animate them all. That said, it's extremely obvious that these were made with preset parts. There's no combination I know of that looks all that natural at all. It's understandable, but as an artist myself, it's a little disappointed to constantly see neat monster combination ideas in my head, but when I actually try it out, it's like, sure, I guess. I just feel like at least a handful of them could have been hand-designed, maybe the ones that made the most thematic sense. Another thing that feels at least slightly lacking is your starters. In this game, you only get a choice of 2. They each have a branched evolution, so technically that makes 4 starters. I feel like you could have covered more ground than just spooky and sweet here for aesthetics. Maybe it doesn't help that in retrospect, I somehow managed to pick my least favorite of all 4. Ramtasm's cool and all, but I could have had Capricorps, or either of Candibal's neat evolutions. Something really working in this game's favor though is how much it never lets the pace die down. It does that thing where tutorials come on via on-screen pop-up, but they usually only kick in as information becomes relevant organically through the gameplay. Rather than doing the usual modern RPG thing of ejecting the pace by dropping a couple paragraphs on your lap because it went out of its way to introduce a new mechanic, here it's usually to explain a new debuff that just cropped up, or go to the trouble of explaining its type advantage system, something it refers to as chemical reactions. type advantage does more than just deal additional damage in this game, as combinations of offense versus defense will cause different effects to kick in, such as lowering stats or triggering this game's version of Substitute to appear. This runs the risk of having too much going on, but it's careful to make sure every interaction intuitively makes sense. Plus, it'll have pop-ups to let you know what effect an attack will have on an opponent, so you don't go accidentally giving them a buff. It also goes out of its way to explain the reasoning behind these type interactions, like how Earth has an advantage over plastic types because of how plastic ends up at landfills. Earth buries plastic, which causes their evasion and speed stats to drop. Lightning beats metal, water, ice, and air because of their conductivity. Hitting a fire type with a plant or plastic move will cause smoke, which ups the fire type's evasion. There's even cases of transmutation, such as fire causing plastic and ice types to melt and turn into poison and water types respectively. Even for the more obtuse types, they simplify the interactions. Astral types are empowered by traditional RPG elements, but the more impure substances like plastic, metal, and poison will have an advantage over them. The only type interaction I scratch my head at is how they say poisons in New Wirral are flammable. Like, oh, sure, I guess. The transmutation system really comes to a head with the glitter type. No monster naturally has the glitter type, instead is applied by a certain move, at which point it transmutes any type into itself and is transmuted into any type it's hit by. It's a hilarious mechanic to be subjected to because it just causes wild chain reactions of everybody's type changing. The sticker system offers a ridiculous amount of customization. Each monster can have a page of stickers applied to them, each sticker giving a new passive effect or new move to use. There's a set of generic moves, each of which are actually typeless, so when you apply it to a monster, it changes into that monster's type. This game does feel a little sparse with move variety though, since a lot of the type-specific moves are eaten up by the coding and wall moves. This ends up making it feel a bit more difficult than it needs to get decent type coverage on a single team. It's impossible to have all your bases covered in this game, I get that, but it feels a little restrictive to have a wall of moves, most of which are the same type. I think it would have been neat to pull a Smash Bros. Brawl and physically apply these stickers to the cassette tapes yourself. Maybe an idea if there's ever a sequel. On top of being able to buy stickers, you're constantly fed a stream of them by giving your cassette tapes more levels, and sometimes you'll be lucky and have an uncommon or rare sticker drop, which adds even more passive effects than normal. Each sticker has an AP cost too, with you gaining 2 AP per turn, which is a fantastic way to make sure weaker moves stay relevant throughout the entire game. You have the basic smack and spit moves, which are just this game's tackle, but having them is almost a must since they cost 0 AP, so you get an AP surplus each time you use them. If you want to use this game's extra powerful moves, you'll have to play strategically to build up your AP for it. In general, I really enjoyed this game's leveling system, as someone that was routinely changing up my team, either to suit the needs of the current situation or because I was being just plain indecisive. It's not the tape's level that determines the strength of the monster, because in this game, it's you turning into that monster. It goes off your trainer level instead. Each monster just has static stat spreads. The only thing the star level determines is whether or not a creature is ready to be remastered, this game's name for evolution. Once you hit 5 stars, you can remaster your tape the next time you rest. A lot of beasts have branched evolutions too. Some can have obtuse conditions, but that's perhaps par for the course anymore. Like, if you really insist on knowing, you can just check the wiki. I just wish they'd clue you in on which evolution you were about to commit to. The level system really does wonders for experimenting and trying any new creature you come across. That way they can slot in just fine without too much hassle. You can even catch early game monsters and not have to grind them up to your level. This pairs is doubly nice considering this game has a partner system, with it just not being you on this island. You're joined by a set of characters, each of which comes with their own monster, but you can also assign them whatever you want. In some cases, they're required to tag along in order to make progress on their quest line, ensuring you bring them along, but other than this, they feel largely unnecessary. See, you don't start out with the ability to fuse with each of them other than Kaylee, who you get to fuse with as soon as the tutorial ends. Because of that though, dragging them anywhere that isn't places they're mandatory for can feel like dragging dead weight around, especially for those extra hard fights where fusion can really come in handy. There's also a whole relationship level thing, which powers up your fusions as you become closer friends. The thing is, you can't start leveling this up until you've had the mandatory fusing fight with each partner. This gives Kaylee an extra edge over everybody else because you can start bonding with her basically as soon as the game starts. I had her maxed out before I had anyone else at level 2. It's not the biggest deal because the game doesn't punish you for hauling Kaylee everywhere. I just feel like each partner should have equal opportunity to shine, especially since not all quests are equal. Barkley's is almost over as soon as you get him. You just fight a unique monster and that's it. The most involved it gets is that you need the climbing ability to get it started. Felix's is set up like it's gonna be a big thing, but by the time you start his quest, you probably already have all the altars with a fast travel point nearby. I kinda ended up beating the whole thing in 15 minutes. Meanwhile, Eugene spans almost the whole game, with there being landlord buildings in all corners of the map. As such, you don't get to fuse with him until way later, but when the main quests shine, they're really fun. While the others are a little too routine, you have the 12 captain fights, essentially this game's gym leaders. They're hidden all around the world, with you needing to fight each one to prove you can join the Rangers yourself. They aren't just gym leaders though. Rather than their gimmick be an entire type, they're usually themed around a particular move or strategy. There's one that uses wall and coding moves, another focusing on using Gambit to try and sweep your team before their Gambit timer runs out and KOs themselves. These fights end up being so much more involved than gym battles. I like approaching each one not quite knowing what to expect and having to adapt on the fly to whatever they're putting down. Some of them I even have to dip out and come back when I've rethought my strategy. One of them is the fight against a weather reporter, the gimmick being her partner will endlessly use Avalanche, a move that snows in the battlefield for a turn, making it so melee attacks will fail that round. The next attempt I came back having rearranged my stickers to include more ranged attacks so I could have a much easier fighting chance. Then, of course, there's the Archangel fights, this game's take on including bigger, more traditional RPG boss fights. Archangels are monsters portrayed to be human concepts incarnated in physical form, their presence causing a glitching status effect that gets the idea across that even in-universe the character's having trouble processing what they're looking at. For one thing, I'm a big sucker for when a creature's otherworldliness is expressed by having them exist in a different art style to the rest of the title. It's just such an effective way to make them look like they don't belong. They're all visually surreal, or at least much stranger than even this game's more oddball monsters. Like, if a friend told me these were witches from a new season of Madoka Magica, I'd probably believe them. Their not-of-this-world nature comes with them bending the rules of the game, all of them being completely typeless and usually having some sort of gimmick and some moves only they can learn, such as Poppy Talks, who has 2 puppets alongside it, striking them causing you to take damage instead. Thing is, at the start of each round, Poppy Talks will swap places with one of them, leaving you to figure out the tell for which one he switches with. Or the Nowhere Monarch, which will call for backup until its AP meter is filled, and it sends its minions to explode in your face. I think the only outright dud of an Archangel fight is Robin Goodfellow, who just dumps paralyzing debuffs on you into infinity, so if you go in unprepared, it's quite likely you won't even get to do anything. Compare that to how easy it is to cheese just by using Taunt on a faster monster and having some form of sleep resistance, and, I don't know, doesn't really feel that satisfying to beat, just feels like a sticker star boss. The late game ones can be difficult, albeit a bit war of attrition. Fusion can be a godsend here, giving you that extra boost of fighting power. This game in general is a little harder than Pokemon tends to be. Most of the time it is fair, but sometimes it comes in the form of getting swamped with a comical amount of debuffs. It would be a little less annoying if you could bail out of fights, but of course, once you start trainer battles, you're stuck in them. Even with wild encounters, the game can be needlessly stingy with a flee chance. In that same vein, trying to actually catch the monsters feels like it's a bit more difficult than it needs to be. Rather than simply throwing a Pokeball and waiting on an RNG roll to resolve, there's a bit more of a minigame to it. I would say that's neat because the idea of making the act of catching the monsters more involved than just mindlessly throwing balls and trying to outlast your opponent is a good one. That said, by late game when the moves start hitting really hard, it becomes not as easy to justify catching stuff since doing so makes your trainer vulnerable to attack and can't themselves get knocked out. There's an interesting little idea of risk versus reward here, having to make yourself susceptible to damage while trying to deal damage in return to increase the chance of successful recording. It's less of an issue in normal fights, but when fighting this game's equivalent to legendary monsters, it kinda hits a fever pitch, failing a 25% chance over and over when you only get so many chances. It just got to be too annoying to a point where I stopped bothering to catch them, at least until it was a high enough level to make catching them a little more trivial. Like, I can't imagine the nightmare of trying to hunt for bootlegs of them. Bootlegs are this game's equivalent to shiny Pokemon, but they actually do a little more than just be a different color. They come in one of any of the types, meaning you can have a monster that's normally poison type be a plant type by default. This unfortunately means none of them come in particularly interesting color schemes, since they usually only swap out one color for one of the base element colors. They do at least have a chance of appearing as the elusive glass type, which normally only one beast exists in, and they can even spawn as a native glitter type, despite absolutely no monsters being that type normally. Because of this, bootlegs aren't as rare as shinies, since they have an actual effect on gameplay and exist more than just a flex that you're lucky. From what I understand, the chance is something like 1 in 1,000, so you're very likely to get one before the playthrough's over. I managed to get a hold of 3 by the time I beat the final boss. I can see this adding a ton to the game's replay value, since you can technically acquire any beast in any type, skyrocketing your options. Like, I can very easily come back to this game and start using whatever interesting bootleg I happen to come across. Bootlegs also get procedurally generated move pools, so they aren't just limited to their normal form's moves. On top of all this, bootlegs also have a chance of pulling more rare stickers than normal, making them extra enticing to hang around. All these excuses for repeat playthroughs, and that's not even getting into the built-in randomizer modes that unlock when you beat the game for the first time. And of course, I like me some customizable difficulty options, where you can flex how smart the enemy AI is, or even how harsh the game's level curve is. This game handles difficulty decently well in general. I just wish that perhaps the game's dungeons were a bit more involved, because they all basically have a single set piece and little else. It can help in keeping things from getting monotonous, like some of Pokemon's early dungeon design can be, but it feels a little lame to constantly be teased by some interesting dungeon ideas only for them to end before they really get started. Even the final dungeon ends really anticlimactic in this regard. You got this cool extra-dimensional train station atmosphere set up only for it to be 2 dead ends branching from the center room, and that's it. Just grab 2 keys and you're done. That isn't to say exploration isn't satisfying for the most part, though. This is technically an open-world game, and there's a lot of hidden secrets throughout the title. Not a lot of them worth the headache of getting, sadly, but you'll never know when you'll come across something a little bit more involved, like encountering one of the boss fights, finding rogue fusions to fight, and maybe even finding an extra secret cave. This game is very open-ended. Usually its only way of gatekeeping certain parts of the world being various movement abilities you unlock by recording certain monsters. I do think they clue you in on which monsters give set abilities though, especially with how easy it is to miss Jumpkin, being a fixed encounter you can only find in one area. It is otherwise freeing to know you can tackle the various objectives throughout the game in any order you choose. A big help are the NPCs in Harbor Town, who will occasionally feed you a hint towards something you can do, even including the various locations of rogue fusions in this game's legendary monsters if you're late enough into the game, which makes hunting them down far less of a chore. That's something you definitely can't knock the game for overall, with it having so much value for your buck, and some pretty decent production value to boot, for the most part. I'm just going to rip off the band-aid and say this game's performance is pretty bad, quite regularly stuttering and freezing in place because this game needed a second to think because I dared to use the fast dash. It kind of takes me out of the atmosphere when every now and then when I move from chunk to chunk, I stop dead in my tracks while wild encounters are free to run at me. This wouldn't be the end of the world in an RPG, but in a game with platforming elements in it, having the game freeze momentarily while you're trying to platform is very disruptive. The game's even crashed on me a few times, more than Scarlet and Violet if you can believe it. Thankfully the game is pretty liberal about autosaves. I suspect this is just an issue for the Switch version, given I've seen footage of this game running far smoother than it ever has for me, so just keep that in mind whenever you're deciding on a version. Otherwise, the game has a really strong aesthetic identity, really feeling like an HD 2D remake of an old RPG that never was. Or a what if Pokemon stayed 2D even after Gen 5. It uses a lot of nostalgic memorabilia to go along with the setting, using cassette tapes as Pokeballs, as well as calling back to classic RPGs of the 90s in general. A stroke of genius is how the in-battle UI uses the buttons of a cassette player, even having each button correspond to a particular action. Making a move is the play button, switching monsters to stop because that's the button you push before you switch a cassette tape out, pause for items, and rather amusingly the skip button for fleeing from a battle. I love tiny touches like this because it really shows that the devs cared about this. They thought about this more than just, alright, what's the battle menu gonna look like? The environmental design of the game has a liminal feel to it, especially in areas like the train station dungeons and the abandoned mall. Even the overworld feels empty, not in a no-content way, but feeling more like a no man's land. It does make me wish the train stations had a bit more visual variety. I understand they're train stations because the idea is they're doubling as fast travel points, but they end up visually melding together. It's why I preferred the ones in areas like the Colossus Camp and Fall Down Mall, just because those felt more like pre-Archangel dungeons than even the more involved train dungeons. It's a little lame that one of them pays lip service to Alice in Wonderland, even down to having an eat me cookie and drink me potion mechanic to change sizes. But the environment is just this bland warehouse shed interior rather than looking anything like Wonderland. I'm also in two worlds about the music. On one hand, all the battle themes are really certified bangers, really catchy and energetic. But what's especially cool about them is that you normally only hear them as instrumentals. They all have lyrics that kick in when you pull off a fusion, which especially makes for amplifying cool boss fight moments. There's just something inherently cool about that anime thing where the hero goes super against an especially powerful opponent and starts turning the tides as the lyrics to the main theme kick in. On the other side of the spectrum, though, there is the atmospheric and lo-fi music of the overworld. It's still pleasant music, but not exactly the stuff I'd listen to on my big Vixichrome music playlist, other than maybe the forest theme. It does make me yearn for something that's a bit more adventurous, having an energy that puts the glamorous spin on exploration like old Pokemon games. When on the other hand, I feel like missing that is kind of the point. At the early onset, this game makes it plain and obvious that this is an isekai, a detail I initially rolled my eyes at simply because I'm just that over isekais. But the more the plot unfolded, the more I saw where they were going with that decision. As it turns out, the entire cast has been isekai'd here, and are now stuck on an island that just sort of seems to be an interdimensional recycling bin. Even Fall Down Mall got isekai'd here. The setting of the title explores how exactly everybody is coping with being stuck on an unknown island that is quite possibly also in a different dimension. Some have learned to make the most of it, seeing New Wirral as their new home. Others have been succumbing to desperation, holding out hope to get back home. It's through the game's tone that, at least in my mind, the lack of upbeat adventurous overtones is the title's way of denying that familiarity with the player. For a game where it's fair to assume most of its intended target audience has played a Pokemon game before, it feels like a pretty fair way to elicit feelings of, media homesickness. This ends up bleeding into the game's themes, which is the strange dimension of New Wirral where fiction seems to become real. Almost all of the monster designs themselves are based on mythology, cryptozoology, invention, or some other figure often fabled about, with it having stuff like vampires, Yukionas, jackalopes, jack-o'-lanterns, Jack the Ripper, the works. Some are even pretty obvious references to other media, like the Trifinx being a clear reference to War of the Worlds tripods. As I mentioned before, one of the station dungeons is based on Alice in Wonderland, even capping it off with a boss who's a cross between Alice and the Queen of Hearts. When you do Felix's quest, you happen across an old DeviantArt-style OC in the form of Kuneko, who is quite literally Felix's first ever character brought to life. One of the main party is just straight up Viola from Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. They even go out of the way to state she's a character from fiction in your universe. You get the point. Even the Archangels are embodiments of ideas and concepts created by humans, though the Archangels you fight are all embodiments of rather negative aspects of humanity, willing ignorance, manipulating people, blind consumerism, the way capital gain is valued over human life. All this builds up to Aleph, who you find capturing all the Archangels you defeat. Around the time you're almost done rounding them up, Aleph reveals that he himself is also an Archangel. As the embodiment of conquest, he's visited dozens of worlds, laying waste to all of them. You get a peek at this when he tries to trap you in one of the worlds he's ruined. It's here, then, that the game starts to rather unsubtly show its themes here. See, when you complete the main quest by defeating the Old Women Yuri team, Ianthe gives you her theory on why exactly cassette tapes can cause people to transform into beasts in New Wirral, to which she talks about how art is imagination made manifest. taking what only exists in our heads and giving it physicality it normally wouldn't have without that very human urge to create. On the surface, it sounds like a non sequitur, but I feel like it just states the themes of the title outright, which is fine, you know. Not every piece of art has to have its themes be a puzzle box. It would seem to me then that the beasts themselves are a metaphor for art and human culture, beings born from imagination and can be recorded onto a cassette tape, a form of physical media, to make it reproducible. Hence why Kuneko, quite literally art brought to life, is just another one of the beasts you can record. The conflict of the main story then becomes one of human evils versus the good in humanity, all the archangels you fight being embodiments of something that has brought measurable harm to the world. This makes it quite fitting that the final battle is against an enemy who is quite literally a dark mirror that reflects humanity's urge to destroy, the thematic opposite of what the main cast embodies, one who wants to assemble a team of humanity's faults and use them to destroy said humanity. It then perhaps becomes a symbolic gesture when Aleph destroys your cassette player during the final battle. As a being that embodies some of humanity's suffering, he denies that human ingenuity is of any value, especially in the wake of an amalgamation of evils. Humans have done evil things within our short existence, but at the same time, no matter what, people still come together for each other, because community will always outlast the evils. Humans are their culture and their art, and that unity to make something greater makes the collective creative effort of humanity last so much longer than the cruel things people have done. Cassette Beasts sets its world up as a metaphor for revisiting an old piece of media you once enjoyed as a kid, that, while you still enjoy fondly, isn't the same as the magic you felt the first time. It denies the bombastic adventure tones the genre is known for, and even occasionally interrupts itself to remind you that the world outside of the media isn't exactly in the best state. Much like how escapism isn't a cure, it doesn't make our problems magically get better. But it doesn't take the low-hanging fruit of being accusatory, blaming the player for simply using this video game as a means to plug their ears and ignore the problems happening outside. It very much acknowledges that art is an inseparable part of the human existence. We tell fiction because there's interesting stories there. We make culture because the only thing inherent to the human existence is being social, sharing that experience with each other. Like, for God's sakes, we're a species that have been painting recreationally before we even found out how agriculture worked. It just points out the dangers lurking beneath the ground that threaten the real world if we choose to ignore them completely. This is why the game doesn't end when you defeat the final boss. You're warned leaving is a one-way trip, so you're given the chance to do everything you want before leaving the world. Because you're ultimately the one that decides when your time with the fictional world is over and you have to get back to real life. The characters you've gotten attached to may not be able to physically join you, but you can't always take them with you in spirit. While Cassette Beasts is far from perfect, it has a lot of evident heart in it, and it's felt all throughout the title. There's even a decently sized amount of post-game content that unlocks once you defeat Aleph, up to and including rematches with all the captains and archangels, as well as unlocking additional fights against a new archangel and Morgant at her full power, as a couple of extra hard post-game bosses. They're also adding free DLC updates, including new side areas and monsters to evolve and catch, something to revisit the title every now and then too, as well as making repeat playthroughs a little extra fresh next time around. But until then, Cassette Beasts serves, while not an earth-shattering redefinition of what a monster catcher is, having most of the same melodies, it is at least a damn good remix.